It's typically 700,000 or so students in our state over grades 3 through 8, 10th grade, and then ultimately in 11th grade science here as well. We know this has been a really complicated year. The U.S. Department of Education has indicated, generally speaking, they are not interested in blanket waivers for assessments. They are certainly going to offer waivers on accountability. What do we mean by that? It means states that tie assessments to letter grading, states like ours who have an index that we put every school district on that is fed by assessments, a 95% test participation rate. Those accountability things are likely going to be waived in all the states. But right now, the default for the U.S. Department of Ed is that we would carry out all of our spring summative assessments. In our case, for the state of Washington, we're part of a consortium, the Smarter Balanced Consortium. Those would be the assessments that we would typically use. You're going to hear today from Dr. Michaela Miller, our Deputy Superintendent. Perhaps others will have a presentation for you to describe an alternative approach that we are seeking. We do not think it is necessarily the best choice in this complicated year to bring 700,000 students to bear on 7, 8, 9, 10 hours of testing by the time they do math, ELA, and in some grades science. You can jot this number down. By what you are about to hear from us as an alternative proposal, we think we can save 4.5 million instructional hours just this spring alone that would otherwise go to combined assessment efforts for these students statewide. Assessments are very important. We think they have a very powerful role in our state, but for the assessments this year, what we're going to propose to the U.S. Department of Education through a formal waiver of the assessment process is twofold. We're going to try to make sure that local school districts are assigned the responsibility of doing local assessments in the classroom. They are expert at that. That gives them real-time feedback on student learning and where interventions and support services need to be acutely deployed for student success. The other purpose for this, though, is to have real storytelling power with statistical significance about what happened this last year, what happened over the last year with respect to learning, and be able to do it, again, with real rigor to understand different student groups, different geographies, different grade bands. We want a sample size, is what we're going to propose here, so robust that it serves the purposes of meeting federal accountability, gets us the data that we need so we can deploy state resources specifically for student populations, geographies, and supports that are needed, but do that at a fraction of the time and a fraction of the number of students who would take assessments this spring. It is not an easy task. With that, I will turn it over to Dr. Michaela Miller. She'll take us through this with presentation. Appreciate you being a part of this. This is a high priority for our state, and I hope you get questions answered and a clear pathway here, which we'll describe for feedback. It is a very tight turnaround, however, so appreciate your time. Michaela.
Thanks, Chris. Good evening, everybody. We are going to walk through a PowerPoint slide deck that will take you through the high-level explanation of the waiver request. It is also posted on our website, and we will make sure that we put that in the chat or in the Q&A so that you can access that. It went out to all school districts yesterday. This is the team Chris mentioned, amazing team here. Dr. Deb Kame, Glenna Gallo, Veronica Gallardo, Dr. Elizabeth Sanders, and Dr. Chun Wayne are here to walk you through this PowerPoint, explain the high-level pieces of the sampling methodology, answer your questions, and provide an opportunity to explore our waiver. Next slide. So at a high level, Chris described it, and you'll see this a couple of different times throughout the presentation today. But just to reiterate, the Department of Ed is offering a waiver for accountability. We are, but not offering a waiver around the assessments this spring. We think we have a better approach that will lessen the footprint of the assessments for this spring by using a representative sample of students in selected grades and content areas. We'll be able to report those statewide results by student group. And then we will waive the ESSA requirements to identify schools for support, which is part of that accountability component. Noted at the bottom of this slide, there is no waiver. We are proceeding with our English language proficiency assessment, otherwise known as ELPA, for this spring, and that window did already open for students to access, for teachers to access that ELPA proficiency assessment. Schools that were currently identified, again, going back to the last bullet there, which is the waiving the ESSA requirements to identify schools for support. If you're currently identified, they will maintain that status for the 21-22 school year. And please note that students with disabilities will be included within the representative sample in the selected grades. So why, how, and when? In summary, we, Chris already mentioned this, really focusing, and we know all of our educators in the state are focusing on district, school, and classroom-based assessments. That's where the focus should be, especially as students are re-entering in-person learning. So prioritizing that instructional time is paramount right now in our state. And we do know, we've done some calculations that taking the assessments as they would typically be administered would result in 4.5 million instructional hours lost this spring. And so we want to lessen the impact by applying for this waiver. We will be able to report those statewide results by student group, emphasize what already districts are doing, district-based assessments, and then overall reduce the impact of testing. So the sample, which we'll get into a little bit more detail in just a few slides, is a stratified two-stage sample. So 3rd and 7th grade graders in that sample would take ELA. 5th and 10th graders would take the mathematics Smarter Balance assessment, and then the 8th graders would take the science assessment. We've been working with the University of Washington on the sampling methodology, and we'll get into a little bit more detail in just a few slides on that. Also want to stress that early on, our Smarter Balanced folks went through a process of shortening the overall blueprint of the exam. So it's about 2/3 the length. So the assessments around ELA and math are about 2/3 the length of the typical assessment. The release of the waiver document went out yesterday. We plan to, we opened it for public comment starting then, and it will close on the 22nd, which is next Monday at close of business. We will look and analyze all that feedback, incorporate those, and plan to submit on the 23rd. As we're planning this, we're parallel planning the sampling methodology and plan for the Smarter Balance assessment for those sampling grades to open on the 5th of April through June 11th, a science assessment on the 12th through the 11th, and WAAIM through April 30th. Want to focus again on the why of what we're doing here. We know that there's been a disproportionate impact on many of our communities, especially as we're transitioning, many of our schools are transitioning to in-person learning. Understanding the impact is really important for you at the local level and also at the state level. Early on, we made the decision not to do any remote testing. And so we are going to stand by that. That was by recommendation of our technical advisory committee at the state level, as well as just knowing the realization of having the impact that would have to try and administer remote assessments. It is a representative sample in those grades and content areas. So instead of the 17 grades and content areas, it's 5. We want to contextualize this data within the bigger framework. And one of the ways we want to do that is through the COVID student survey, which looks at the well-being and social emotional supports that students are needing as we think about recovery and planning for next year. That registration for the COVID student survey is open now through March 22nd. And we encourage districts to register and have your students take that survey. And then, as I mentioned before, prioritizing that instructional time. We know for many districts across the state, they may just be doing back to school events right now to introduce in-person learning. Many have already been back, and so they're continuing in hybrid models, but prioritizing that instructional time is paramount for us. So the three prongs or three goals for our approach: reduce the number of students that are taking this assessment. That's in targeting those, so it's more specific. We also are interested in positioning the statewide assessment inside of a larger framework of assessment that includes district-based, classroom-based, and school-based assessment systems. And then increase, as I mentioned, the 4.5 million instructional hours lost. We strongly believe that increasing the time and resources to support those students social emotionally, academically, physically, getting back in person is the highest priority. So some additional information just to give a broader picture of where this sits within all of the moving parts at the local level. We had our reopening schools report March 1st, reopening schools proposal from school districts was due on March 1st, and those are just being finalized and completed. We have the academic and student well-being recovery plan that is due on June 1st for districts. I already mentioned the COVID student survey for grades 6 through 12. We are going to do and proceed with a full administration of the ELPA. We are looking at student absences, course and credit completion, and we know locally you're looking and analyzing that data to assess what students need next in their academic career. And then we also have a weekly reopening status update on our website that shows the amount of in-person learning each district is doing. So the reporting of assessment results, it will be statewide reporting only. So it will be anonymized and reported back at the state level. Student groups will be reported in statewide results. Districts and school results will not be reported. As Chris mentioned at the top of the webinar, we are asking for a full waiver for the accountability parts of the federal law. And individual students' results will be available for students who take the assessment. And I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Deb Kame, who will take you through the sampling methodology.
Thank you, Michaela. So what are we proposing? What is our request to the U.S. Department of Education? So a couple of things. We're proposing to lessen the footprint of assessment. And so one part of that is to have a representative sample of students to take the statewide assessment. And we're proposing to test fewer grades and subject areas. Also, the Smarter Balanced assessments in ELA and math will be shorter this year than they have in previous years. The comprehensive assessment of science will be the same length. Another aspect is to request to waive accountability and some reporting requirements. So schools that have been identified for support previously will retain their status for the 21-22 school year. And then lastly, big picture about what we're requesting from the Department of Ed is that we would report statewide results by student group. So we will have a lighter footprint of testing and then still be able to get meaningful information at the statewide level. So how are we going to reduce the footprint? So the proposal is to have fewer grades and content areas and reduce it to 5 grade levels, as Michaela mentioned, with only 1 subject per grade. So for English Language Arts, that would be grades 3 and 7, and that includes Smarter Balanced and waAIM. For math, it would be grades 5 and 10, and for science, it would be grade 8. So also, fewer students per grade rather than all students. So we want the sample to be representative, so we'll be using something called a stratified 2-stage cluster sampling plan, And I will explain more about that in just a moment. And we've been collaborating with Professors Wang and Professor Sanders at the University of Washington College of Education. So this is just a different view. It's a visual of looking at which grades and subjects will be tested. So the 5 that we've mentioned are in yellow, and then kind of in the gray background are the grades that are typically tested. So 5 instead of 17 areas. So the sample per grade will be around 10,000 students out of roughly 80,000 students per grade. So 1 out of 8. So when you factor in the 2 aspects of reducing the footprint, which is fewer grades and content levels and fewer students per grade, we wind up with around 4% of tests compared to what we do in a typical year. So the sampling plan. So how would schools or students be selected? Who gets into the sample? For each of the 5 grade levels, we'll do a stratified 2-stage sample. And what that means is that from each educational service district, each ESD, we will randomly sample 50% of districts. And that's stage 1. And stratifying means that each ESD will have districts included, and it makes the sample representative. Then, among the 50% of districts that have been selected in each ESD, we'll randomly select 25% of schools. And then among the selected schools, all students in that grade level would be assessed. So the process, randomly select 50% of districts within each ESD, and then 25% of schools within each selected district. And that would happen for each of the 5 tests. So we would select schools for 3rd grade ELA, and then under a separate process, we would select schools separately for 5th grade math. So that summarizes the sampling plan. I will now turn it over to Glenna Gallo to talk about students with disabilities.
Sorry, technical difficulties on this end. So for students with disabilities who have an IEP under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, they are being included in the sampling plan. So what that means is if the district and school is selected, whether the student participates in the SBA, the WCAS, or the WAAIM, as per their IEP, they would also be part of that sampling plan and would be administered the assessment. We do know that the testing window for the WAAIM has already started, and that has impacted the assessments for a select group of students. However, the U.S. Department of Ed just released the waiver option most recently. And so this is the first opportunity that Washington has had an opportunity to apply for a waiver of assessing all students. We do know that students participating in the WAAIM, that those results will be scored and honored, even if they are not selected as part of the sample. And the information is useful to both their families and IEP teams. And then also students with disabilities who are English learners are also to be included in the administration of English proficiency assessments, which will not be waived. And next up is Veronica, who's going to talk more specifically about English learners.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. So yes, English language learners. We are requiring that everyone take, all our state identified students take the bilingual education assessment. And that is state identified students. It's critical in that we make sure it's state identified students who take this assessment. We ask that districts make sure they provide in-person, in-school building opportunities for this assessment. Districts will also communicate with our families and guardians the provision of in-person assessments. We want to make sure that our families are aware that this assessment is taking place for their state identified students and the provisionally identified students. What we mean by provisional is that many students who are new to the district this year were not able to take a placement assessment. The English language proficiency assessment will serve as a placement assessment as well. So it is critical that we try to get as many students in the assessment process as soon as possible. The testing window begins March 22nd and closes June 4th. We expanded the assessment window, understanding that you will need more time and to get our students in, our 134,000 students. Districts, we ask that you please provide the rights for family to opt out of the assessment if they deem it's unsafe for their child. There's a variance in how districts respond to that. So we are not requiring a written letter of opting out because we understand that some students who are not directly in school services may find that challenging. So we at minimum ask you to post it on their district website as well as the school website of your process for opting out of services. But again, most important, our assessment window is March 22nd through June 4th. And we ask that you provide in-person, in-school building assessments for all state identified bilingual students. And now I will go to the next steps. So here we are in summarizing everything that we will be doing next. Public comment is open for March 16th through the 22nd. We ask that you provide your comments and they should be submitted via the 2021 Assessment Waiver Public Comment Survey. So that means that by March 22nd, we will be closing that by 5 p.m. So we really urge you to do your best and provide comments so that we can then incorporate those comments into the feedback or the waiver. OSPI will then submit the waiver with the public comments, a summary of the public comments, to the United States Department of Education March 23rd. And again, as you can see at the bottom here, we have the public comment survey. Deadline again is March 22nd, so that's a very short window by 5 p.m. Send any questions that you have to assessmentwaivercomments@k12.wa.us. Thank you.
Okay, I'm gonna begin by addressing a few of the questions that are in the chat, and then some of my colleagues may pick up and answer some as well. So a couple of questions around the Smarter Balanced. It will include both the computer adaptive section as well as the performance task. The way that it is shorter is that the computer adaptive part is 1/2 the length of what it was typically. So that the test overall, we're estimating will be around 2/3 or 70% of what it is in a typical year, but it does include both components of the Smarter Balanced test. There was a question about whether or not students will be identified individually or by school. It's a school level identification, so then students who are enrolled in the school would be expected to test if the school is randomly selected.
Deb, I can take a couple at the top if you want to keep looking for ones.
Okay.
The question at the top around 12th graders needing to pass the SBA, ELA, and math. I want to just remind everyone, this is around the federal waiver that we're requesting specifically around the requirement from the feds for us to test. The Smarter Balance assessments as a pathway is a state level policy and law. And so for the SBA pieces around 12th graders or even 11th graders, for this year, the state board passed and are adopting rules around a waiver for those. And we're happy to put in the chat the link to the state board waiver for this year's graduating seniors. Next question is about the social studies CBAs. Again, this is only about the required 3rd through 8th ELA and math and science assessments for the federal requirement for testing. And so any laws around other subject areas that are at the state level would not be included in this waiver. I'll turn this over around anticipation for the schools to be identified in the sampling. This is a little bit of a two-step process for us, but we are working on parallel tracks. One is getting the sampling methodology all dialed in and figured out with our partners at the University of Washington, and are also going to be waiting for a response from the feds. I noticed a comment or question in here about the timing. Yes, it is very quick timing. We just received a letter just a couple of weeks ago announcing that they would not be accepting blanket waivers for testing this spring. And just a reminder that we did back in August ask for a waiver. We were told that they would not be accepting blanket waivers, which moved us into the last couple of months looking at this opportunity to just sample rather than test 600,000 or 700,000 students.
Excuse me, there are some questions in the chat about ELL, about the ELPA. Veronica, I'm wondering if you can go over some of that information again. Thank you.
Yes, happy to. I'm taking a look right now. I'm looking. Yes, all ELLs definitely are to take the ELPA 21. The assumption is we will communicate, districts will communicate that the students have must take the ELPA 21, but we understand that some families may choose to opt out of the assessment, and they have that right to opt out as well. So.
There are some questions in here. A couple of notes. We will be publishing an FAQ after this webinar. So part of the reason for doing this webinar is to gather the kinds of questions that would be posted onto a frequently asked questions that we will put up on our website, same website that the current waiver is sitting on. And so there are some questions that we just simply don't have definitive answers on right now. I will say about some of the opting in, opting out questions, we will address those. Right now, we're focused on getting the waiver out, public comment in, and getting this proposal to the U.S. Department of Ed. That is our singular focus right now over the next week. We know there is such a short timeline for that, but we will be addressing some of these questions that you have in the chat. So.
Yes, so this is Veronica again, and one of the questions is around ELPA 21 could be used in place of the screener. That's correct, but again, yes, there is a 30-day of returning to school in-person instruction. So in many cases, since it's March 22nd when we start the assessment, that 30-day window may not apply. So you would provide, if you haven't done the assessment within that 30-day window, the screener that is, you would then do the ELPA 21 annual assessment, 2 different assessments. And let's see, there's a couple of more here for ELL. Yes, if you are providing at-home instruction is receiving at-home instruction, again, yes, the family can opt out of the assessment.
So I'm going to throw a question to Liz and Chun here to talk a little bit more about the actual sampling from a regional perspective. The question is, when ESD 101 has 60 of the 295 school districts, how will they not skew results? So if you could talk a little bit about that methodology.
Sure. So I don't know where the specific question is. I was just trying to scroll through everything. But we are the plan is to proportionally sample schools within districts and also districts within ESDs. So it will be proportionate to the size of each ESD and of each district to make sure that it is representative, the sample. Chen, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think that's it. Thanks.
I'm looking at looking at boxes really, but I'm looking at the team here to see if there are any other questions that you can elevate. Deb, do you want to talk a little bit about our tentative timeline as we're moving forward on school identification for the sampling?
Yeah, I was just looking at that one. So we are working with the University of Washington, but we're thinking that possibly by a week from Friday that we might be able to have that information. We're still working on it. We anticipate that the testing window will open for Smarter Balanced will open on April 5th, but we believe that we can have the information out to schools in advance of that time, and that leaves the testing window into June, so it leaves nearly 3 months, or excuse me, 2 months to do the assessments.
For the rest of the team, there seems to be a lot of questions about opt-out. Did anybody want to comment on that?
So in any normal, whatever normal is anymore, year, there's always a parent opt-out option. We are planning for a certain number of opt-outs within the sampling methodology as a whole. And so that's part of the planning process that our team has gone through. Without knowing the specifics of the schools and the situations that those schools are in, we are anticipating that there will be follow-up answers to this opt-out question because we do realize there are some students that are in person and some that are remote. So we will have follow-up answers on that in a future Q&A.
I'm still getting a lot of questions about the opting out. I really want to explain the reason we are opting out for bilingual education, the ELPA 21. I want to explain one of the reasons that the federal department and we agree that it's important for our students to take the assessment, our English language learners, is that one, it would be a second year where we are keeping students in a program that they potentially do not need to be in, right? They have the potential to exit out of EL services with this assessment. The other and most important is the fact that the assessment provides one piece of data that tells us if the student is making gains in English language proficiency or not. And so that is a critical piece of information for both the student and the teacher. It also provides teachers information on both English language teachers and general education teachers, the proficiency level, and how to design for EL teachers the specially designed instruction that needs to happen. So without that data, it will be harder to meet the needs of designing English language materials to support the student. And it will be hard to offer exiting services since we don't know how the student would perform and they wouldn't be able to exit out. Thank you.
I think there is a question about would it be plausible for a selected school to have both grades selected? For example, a selected elementary school would test both ELA and math. The answer is yes, but the probability is very small in that regard, because we do sampling per grade separately. So it is possible that a school will be selected twice for assessment, but the chance is very low.
So I want to reiterate one question that has come up a couple of times in the chat around statewide reporting. This will not be at a school level. So I know that's in everybody's mind about the typical accountability system that we've had in place, but we are reporting this at a statewide level. So student groups in those grade levels will be at a state level and not at an individual school level. So I just want to reiterate, that's an important point. It is a waiver that the feds are offering, and we are going to be applying for a waiver for school level accountability. Sorry, Deb, I think you were going to jump in.
Yeah, there was a question around how many students take the NAEP in the NAEP sample, which NAEP was canceled for this year, but in a typical year per grade, there are around 3,000 or 3,500 for both subjects. So this is a larger sample than NAEP conducts, but we feel like it'll give a better representativeness for some of the small student groups. So it's necessary to have a larger sample.
There are a couple of questions about whether or not the feds will deny this waiver. I don't have a crystal ball. I sure wish I did the last year, but we don't know that. We are pursuing this with the intent that they will approve this plan. As we mentioned at the top, and Chris mentioned, they are not approving blanket waivers for states. We do know that. And so our approach is different than what a blanket waiver would be asking for. It is a sample. So we are hopeful that we will get approval, but we do not know that yet.
And I see a question about opting in to the sample as opposed to opting out. And the plan to keep the sample representative for the statewide estimates that we will need is that there will be no opt-ins. It will be a randomly drawn sample. And similarly, same sort of questioning around the sampling plan. We are anticipating that there will be opt-outs, but because we are doing, again, a random sampling plan, we assume that the opt-outs will be proportionate and we will still result in a representative state level sample.
The team see any other questions, Cindy, that we can answer now?
There is a question on here that we have not answered where someone says, how does our district become part of the COVID student survey? Could somebody respond to that?
Registration for the COVID-19 student survey closes March 22nd. And so it's really important for districts to or schools to ask to participate in that and register. We've sent out quite a few communications, so it is really up to the districts to send out the survey to their students. Right now we have over 20,000 completed surveys, and we are definitely hoping for much more. So reach out to your schools directly.
Michaela and team, there are a lot of questions that are more operational in nature. How will students who have opted to be remote learners, how will districts need to respond to them to get them to the schools to take the assessment? And then there's also some questions about schools that have sent home computers for their students to work. How will students have access to computers when they come into the school if selected to be a part of the sample?
So there are a lot of operational, and I know many of the folks on the call right now are in charge of that typically in a school district. So you're in charge of the administration, and our student assessment and information team we'll be providing additional information about the actual administration components of this. For this webinar, it's a high-level explanation of the waiver, and we will definitely have follow-up information and question and answer on our website about some of those pieces, and our student information and assessment team will be getting more information about the specifics around the administration when we get to a point where the randomly selected schools have actually been identified. I think I've already addressed the grad pathways, but just a reminder, this is not about the grad pathway conversation for graduation. This is about responding to the U.S. Department of Ed's federal waiver opportunity for state testing. The State Board of Education has a waiver for the class of 2021. And I believe that link has been put in the chat for you to link to that if you're interested in the State Board waiver of credits and pathways.
So just reiterating what was said, we will be responding to a number of the questions in more detail, some of the more operational questions. We will be producing an FAQ and continually updating it as we learn more information and as things change. So more details about operationalizing and administering the tests this year, we will have that in the FAQ, and we'll distribute those and update it regularly.
All right, team, last call for any questions. The COVID student survey is not required. However, we are strongly encouraging schools. It is a well-built COVID student survey for grades 6 through 12, well-designed by, again, another team at the University of Washington, go Dogs. So we are very much encouraging districts to administer the COVID student survey. Important data for both you at the school level as well as statewide results on that are also anonymized. Wait time, any more questions, Cindy, Glenna?
None from me. I think the remaining questions will be addressed in a forthcoming FAQ document, and we will post clearly answers to these questions on our website. And again, this is our waiver request, and we have to get approval for this request before we know more specifics about the timelines of when students in schools will be identified. Thank you.
I want to thank everybody, thank the team, thank our friends at the University of Washington for their amazing work supporting our state as we pursue this waiver. We really feel strongly that the time is now to lessen the footprint of this state assessment, focus on in-person instruction as much as possible for as many students as possible over the coming months, and want to thank the whole team. Glenna, did you have a comment?
I just wanted to remind everyone that we do have that survey set up to accept public comment through March 22nd. And so we do appreciate and welcome your input. Thank you.
Thanks everyone for tuning in tonight. Appreciate it. Thanks for Glenna for reminding me about the place to put in your comments. We will collect the chat, but we will be using that only as a Q&A jumping off point. So if you do have feedback on the actual plan, which we encourage you to read, that you put that into the survey. So thanks everyone. Thanks everybody, and have a great night.